Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for logging in to participate in our shiur, our class this evening. I'm hoping we are going to try out a couple of new techniques to engage in dialogue, to engage in conversation around some of the makoros that I hope we're going to be sharing in this space. There are a couple of big questions that I want to address, both explicitly and perhaps more subtly. But in specific, there is a gaping hole in the story of Moshe Rabbeinu. And so we're going to dive into that pretty quickly. But before we do, I want to acknowledge that we're not in our usual format. We're not sitting in a Zoom with people having their videos on, their videos off. We're trying a new structure. We're trying something different. And if you have a comment, if you have something to add, if you have something you want to share, please feel free to use the comment tool, the chat tool on Facebook, if you're listening on Facebook, on YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, and I will be able to see your chats. I'll be able to see your comments, and Mirza Hashem, that will be the way we engage in dialogue and conversation with each other around the topics that we're going to discuss, the topics we're going to share. So as you see on your screen, the topic that we're talking about tonight is, are you ready for the Exodus? What values define Moshe's early life? So much happens so quickly at the beginning of the book of Shemot. Remember, straight away we transition from dynamic individuals and personalities. We transition to a much larger lens, a much larger sense of what's going on. We see the whole picture from 30,000 feet. An entire nation is enslaved. They're multiplying greatly. They're growing humongously. Paro, the king of Egypt, is concerned about his political security, the well-being of the country, and so he enslaves an entire nation, an entire people. And we zoom way out. We think about big issues that relate to the well-being of the entire people. And it's very easy as we are reading through Parsha Shemos, it's very easy to lose sight of some of the individual stories, some of the smaller, quieter moments in the Parsha that I think are definitional, that I think are very significant in informing us about not only the journey that the Jewish people were about to undertake, but informing us on who Moshe was. What was he all about? Why was he chosen? So I want to begin by having a conversation about Moshe's early years, the values that defined him. Right? What do we know about Moshe? What conversations have we had about Moshe in the past that informs us regarding the values that he had as a young man? We know he was born into a difficult situation, into difficult circumstances. We know he was hidden away early on, but what are the stories? What are the values that come through? And some of them are more obvious, some of them are less obvious. Let's begin by examining some of the earliest sources about Moshe Rabbeinu. We are starting a couple years into his life. We'll discuss how many years in a minute. Okay, so source number one, we're going to look towards the end of the second chapter in Shemot, the beginning of the third chapter. We have a description of a pretty significant moment in Moshe's life. When he gets married, he has a child, he becomes a parent. One would think that that is a wonderful moment to reflect upon what defines Moshe, what's on his mind as he's becoming an Abba, what's on his mind as he's becoming a parent. So source number one, right in front of you, in English. We're only going to be looking at sources in English right now because the goal here is not to analyze the language of the text too closely, but to consider what values come through, to consider what messages are coming through with the way Moshe interacts with the world. Moshe consented to stay with a man. Of course, the man that we are referring to is Yisro, is the man who would become his father-in-law. He gets married to the man's daughter. Zipporah becomes his wife. She bore him a son whom he named Gershon. The reason he named his son Gershom is because I have been a stranger in a foreign land, Ger Hayiti. I've been a stranger, and this is a value that is definitional for Moshe right now. We begin to see one of his first values, the idea of being a foreigner, the idea of not knowing what it's like to be settled, what it's like to have a home, really. The Psukim continue. A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from bondage rose up to God. The situation remained terrible back in Egypt. Remember, Moshe was not there. Moshe had fled to Midian. We'll get into that in a second. But the situation in Egypt remained terrible. God heard their moaning. God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites and God took notice of them. Right? This was a situation which God was paying attention to. God realized that the time for redemption was coming near, and he was ready. He was hearing the cry of the Jewish people. Chapter 3, verse 1. All while this is happening, while genocide is taking place, while enslavement of the Jews is taking place, while God is hearing the crying out of the voice of the children of Israel, where is Moshe? What is the great champion of the Jews doing? Now Moshe, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Mount Horeb, which we know is Har Sinai, the mountain of God. The verse captures decades of Moshe's life, right? Remember, in verse 23, a long time after that, we're talking about decades after Moshe has a child, decades after Moshe is taken into the family of Yisro. We are told that the king of Egypt dies, there's a new king, and the Jewish people begin to cry out again. In these short 4 or 5 psukim, we cover at least, according to some Mefarshim, 40 years of Moshe's life, if not more. So the question that I want to explore is what happened to Moshe during that time, right? What happened to Moshe during his decades of absence? Where was he? What was he doing? What was he up to? Is there a comparable model that we could learn from that could possibly inform us about how to understand those 40 years where Moshe is completely off the scene? The Jewish people are suffering, and Moshe is shepherding sheep well into the desert, far into the desert. What happened? What is happening to Moshe at that time? Is there a comparable situation? Was Moshe the first character without a full picture? Right? We have many years of Moshe's life, but we are missing a significant gap in his progression from adolescence to fully grown leader. Moshe, remember, when Moshe returns to the Jewish people, he is 80 years old. According to the Midrash, Moshe is 40 when he flees Egypt. According to some Midrashim, he's as young as 12. But let's go with the idea that he's 40. Is there someone comparable who has gaps in his life story? That brings to mind the story of Avraham with Lech Lecha. Let's think about it. Avraham is told, Lech Lecha me'artzcha me'melotzecha b'beis avicha, leave your land. How old is Avraham when he is told that? He is 75 years old when he leaves the land of Israel. We have a major gap in the story of Avraham's life and his experience. Similar to Moshe Rabbeinu, we know very little about what happens, at least from the Torah. We know very little about what happens from Avraham's birth to Avraham hearing the voice of God. We have a huge gap, but are these situations comparable? Can Avraham's missing story, Avraham's missing decades, and Moshe's missing decades really be compared to one another? So what do we know about the missing years of Avraham? Let's think about it. Right? Dig deep into the memory as a child, reading the little Midrash says, or going to Hebrew school. What did we learn about Avraham when he was younger? Again, feel free to chime in the comments or in the chat. I I'm trying to utilize this methodology to engage in conversation in a different format, in a different way. What do we know about Avraham? If you look on your screen, he was gainfully employed young man. This man had income. His father was an entrepreneur, and he was part of the family business, though he was obviously a liability to the family business. Right? He was driven by his values to destroy his idolatry. The Midrashim are filled with magnificent stories about the values that defined Avraham, the young man, the man who was curious, who looked into the world and said, who created the sun and who created the trees? The man who introduced monotheism to the world. The Midrashim are filled with stories about Avraham drawing lines in the sand, being thrown into the fiery furnace. The Midrashim do the hard work of filling the missing years of Avraham. We have already a colorful picture. By the time we meet Avraham at Lech Lecha, by the time we've gone through Hebrew school or Jewish day school, you know the stories of the tremendous resilience and the values that the Avraham HaIvri. He is already by himself on the other side of the river, defining himself. The Torah doesn't fill the picture, but the Midrashim do. So what do we know about Moshe's missing years? Considering the Midrashim set a precedence that they share stories, plenty of stories about Avraham's younger life, you would imagine, you would expect there would be Midrash after Midrash. What was Moshe doing during those 40 years in Midian? What was he up to? Let's keep in mind, Moshe is the greatest prophet to have ever lived. What was he up to during those 40 years? What was he doing? And you'll be shocked to know very little is recorded in the Midrash. There are few legends of Moshe's behavior and development during these quiet years. There's an obscure Midrash that Moshe became a clan king, he became a king, but nothing like the legends that define the first 75 years of Abraham's life. And so, what is going on? Why is this defined? Why is Moshe's silence definitional? So there has to be a major difference. We have to conclude that there's a major difference between the life story of Avraham and the life story of Moshe. Avraham's story in the Torah begins after his missing years. Right? Lech Lecha, the 75 years have already happened. He's introduced to us as a 75-year-old man. And once he's introduced to us, the narrative is shared uninterrupted. The narrative continues from the moment Avraham hears Lech Lecha to the moment he dies. We are present with Avraham. Not so with Moshe. We are introduced in the text to the significant early events in Moshe's life. Right? We learn about his adolescence in the Egyptian palace. The Torah tells us in chapter 2, verse 10, when the child grew up, the child referring to Moshe, she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, she being his nurse, taking care of him. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. And she named Moshe, explaining, I drew him out of the water. The Torah tells us that Moshe kills an Egyptian. Sometime after that, the next verse after what we just read, sometime after that, when Moshe had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk, to his achenu, to his achim, and he witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, one of his brothers. This pasuk is so rich in the values that Moshe defines himself by. He understands that there are people who are being oppressed. He understands that they're his people. And he also understands that he cannot appreciate their oppression. He cannot understand the experience of the enslaved Jews without going out to see them. Moshe becomes a man, he becomes an activist. When Moshe grew up, remember last pasuk, Moshe grows up, moves into the palace. Now Moshe grows up again. and goes out to see the situation. And what does he do? He turns this way, he turns that way. Seeing no one is about, he strikes down and kills the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. A pasuk, again, that is so rich with detail, defining Moshe's values, understanding the considerations that Moshe was taking in that moment. Moshe recognizes that this is a culture, this is a society that will not accept Moshe's activism on behalf of the downtrodden, on behalf of the beaten. Moshe wants to act with justice. He is ready to defend the vulnerable. Yet he understands in Egyptian culture, in Egyptian society, he cannot get away with that value. He looks this way and he looks that way. And the Mefarshim spend a lot of time talking about, he looks into the future and does this Egyptian, and the Pashtus, the simple reading is, Moshe knows he cannot get away with this murder. And the pasuk ends that Moshe hid the body because he realized in this corrupt Egyptian society, he needed to illustrate justice. He needed to defend the downtrodden. And he does. And we know, if we continue studying the Pesukim, Moshe engages directly the very next day with his Hebrew brethren. He goes out again because he wants to see, has his actions made a difference? Has his actions changed him? When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" Moshe couldn't understand what he was seeing. And we know Moshe becomes a fugitive. When Pharaoh learned of the matter, when Paro learned that Moshe had killed the Egyptian, he flees and he arrives in the land of Midian, and he sits down by the well. The conclusion has to be that Moshe's silent years are part of the story. Right? We're told about all of these details in the Torah, in the text itself. We're told about all these values that Moshe has. And then there's a massive gap. There's a 40-year gap. The silence of these years is deafening in the story of Moshe. The Torah deliberately chooses to remain silent. The sages deliberately choose not to add color to those years. The silence is deafening. And so what events, we have to examine the events that lead to Moshe's exile. Right? What events lead to his isolation from society? Let's re-examine some of those Pesukim. Moshe understands that he has to go out and he has to defend the vulnerable. He has a deep moral compass that he has to introduce justice into Egyptian society. And so he goes out and he witnesses the travesty of the beating, the Egyptian taskmaster beating the Jew. He looks around, he doesn't see anyone else standing up. He strikes the Egyptian and he buries him in the sand. Moshe, we are told early on, is a man of justice, is a man of action. And then the next day, he wants to see, have the Jewish people seen his acts? Have they been inspired by the great defender themselves to rise up and overthrow the Egyptian government? We've seen in our lifetime, we've seen the power of people to rise up and overthrow literally the Egyptian government. Moshe wants to know, will the Jews stand up for justice? This is their tradition. His understanding is this is what his brothers and sisters do. And so he goes out the next day and he sees two Jews fighting. And he wants to know, why are you fighting? And they respond, who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill us as you killed the Egyptian? And the Torah says something stunning. Moshe was frightened and he thought the matter is known. Now the Pashtus, the simple reading of that pasuk, is that Moshe was concerned for his safety, for his well-being, that it would come out that he was a murderer. Moshe realized that he could not get away with this murder. But what if Moshe was also tremendously worried that the Jewish people were beyond saving? What if he looked at his brothers and sisters and said, they're fighting with each other instead of fighting for each other? And that's when Moshe gives up. That's when Moshe runs away. That's when Moshe knows this is not a society I can stay in. I can't correct society institutionally, politically. I have to look this way and that way to make sure that no one sees the murder. And then I can't inspire the Jewish people to defend themselves, to live by justice and to demand more of Egyptian society. Moshe gives up. Moshe decides he's done. And what's amazing is you may think at that moment, Moshe Rabbeinu decides he's completely done, but he's not. Where does Moshe go? In the next pasuk, he arrived in the land of Midian, and he sat down by the well. Now let's keep in mind, Moshe didn't run into isolation. Moshe didn't, close his doors and shutter at the world. Moshe went to the gathering spot in Midian. He went and sat down by the well. He went to the water cooler to have a conversation with people, with the locals. Why did Moshe do that? Because Moshe had a cause. Moshe wants to talk about justice. He wanted to talk about society. And so he went to this well to see if there were locals who shared his values. There were locals who could relate to his mission, to his purpose. And he hangs out by the well. And he does meet some locals. The shepherds came and drove them off. He meets the daughters of Jethro, the daughters of Yisro, who are there to water their flock, and they are bullied by the other shepherds. Moshe rose to the defense, the Moshe that we now know, the young Moshe, who is all about defending the vulnerable, defending the weak. He waters the flock. He is there to defend the daughters of Yisro. But that final experience, where the vulnerable daughters of Yisro are bullied by the other shepherds, is too much. Moshe is done. There is no hope left in society. There is no hope left in people. Moshe is finished. Because wherever he turns, whether it be in Egypt defending a Jew, whether it be in Egypt intervening in an argument between two Jews, or it's in Midian by the public gathering space, he sees over and over again that evil is happening. He sees over and over again that the vulnerable is taken for advantage, is prey to the strong. And Moshe makes this unbelievable decision. He makes this unbelievable decision to leave society. He knows he's a Hebrew. He knows that there's a God. He knows that there is a concept of justice. And he decides to go into the wilderness to find that God. Right at the beginning of chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moshe drove Yisro's flock, the sheep, into the wilderness. And he came to Chorev, he came to the mountain of God. And at that mountain, Moshe has an experience that changes everything for him. Now, keep in mind the transition from chapter 2 to chapter 3 is a transition of at least 40 years. Moshe is tending to the flock by himself for 40 years. Moshe knows for 40 years the Jewish people are suffering. He knows there is enslavement. He knows there is injustice, but he quiets the inner activist and says there's no reason to have hope. There's no reason to defend the vulnerable and the weak. When wherever I turn, wherever I go, wherever I interact with society, the powerful takes advantage of the vulnerable. So what does Moshe choose? He chooses to go to a place where there is no society. He chooses to spend 40 years alone in the desert, pondering justice and pondering God. He finds himself at the mountain of God. And at this point, Moshe, we could say a lot about what Moshe sees, what Moshe doesn't see, what Moshe does, and what he doesn't do. The choice of Moshe, and it's consistent with what we know about Moshe. Moshe is a curious and driven personality. He leaves the palace. The Malbim says that the great act of the young Moshe was to leave the palace, because it's not the way of princes and kings and aristocracy to go and mingle amongst the poor and the enslaved. But something was driving Moshe out. And the same thing that drives Moshe out of the palace drives him to the top of the mountain of God. And he notices that there is a bush that is burning on fire, but it itself is not being consumed. It is surviving. And this is when Moshe transforms. This is when Moshe starts his long journey from hopeless to hopeful. This is when Moshe understands, for the first time in his life, that there is a critical X factor when you're an advocate. There is a critical element that you need when you're pursuing justice. What does God say to Moshe? God says to Moshe, I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to go back to your brothers and sisters and redeem them. And Moshe says, who am I? Rabbi Sachs, Zeich Livracha, was fond of sharing, this is one of his most wonderful ideas, that the first words that Moshe utters to God, Mi Anochi, who am I? And the last speech that Moshe gives in the Torah begins, Ela Dvarim Asher Diber Moshe. Moshe, who was lacking words, after 40 years in the desert with the Jewish people, is a man who is filled with words. He fills up a fifth of the Torah with his words. Excuse me. According to Moshe, according to the Midrash, Moshe is 40 years old when he flees Egypt. He is 80 years when he returns. In 40 years of isolation and wandering, after he shares that he has given up hope on all people, God reminds him that he is not free to do so. God says, my name is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And he continues, thus you shall say to the Israelites, to your brothers and sisters, Ehyeh sent me. So there's a couple of things to notice about this pasuk. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh draws our attention to the fact that God introduces himself one way to Moshe and tells Moshe to introduce himself another way to the Jewish people. God introduces himself by saying, Ehyeh She'ehyeh. But don't tell that to the people. Just tell the people, Ehyeh. What's going on? What does it mean, that name? I am what I am. I'll always be what I'll always be. What's going on there? So Rav Soloveitchik draws our attention to the idea that Moshe is saying, that God is saying to Moshe, I am with the Jewish people in Egypt. I am wherever humanity is to be found. And I will always be with the Jewish people, whether they be suffering or whether they be thriving, whether they're facing difficulties or whether they're living a calm, safe, secure life. The promise that God makes to Moshe is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am always here. I am always present. I am present now with the Jews in Egypt, and I am present, and I will always be present with the Jews whenever they're suffering, The reason, according to the Orach Chaim Kadosh, the reason why God says only say yeah is because a nation that's enslaved can't think about future enslavements. Go to them and tell the Jewish people, tell the Israelites in Egypt that I am with them. But Moshe, you need to know, I will never abandon them like you did. I will never run away like you did. I am with the people no matter where they may be found. In the words of the Rav, if there is a world, if anything at all is real, and no one who has not been ensnared by vain sophistries has any doubt about this, then there is a God who is the foundation and origin of everything that exists. If there is a self, if man exists, and this too all human beings know with certainty, we know that we exist, then there is a living personal God who fills the consciousness of the self. It is impossible to think, to speak, to discuss the reality of the world and the reality of man without living and sensing the source of being. I am that I am, God says. Because humanity exists, you know I exist. The Rav continues. Just as someone who sees a tree does not deduce indirectly that there are roots under the ground, for completely how a nation of lowly slaves can be transformed into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. No human leader can accomplish such a metamorphosis. It can only be accomplished through my active participation. The Rav says something amazing. Why does Moshe give up? Moshe gives up advocating for the Jews in those early years. He leaves society because he looks at society and he sees it void of any hope. He sees all of the reasons to be hopeless. He sees a Mitzri oppressing Jew. He sees Jew fighting with Jew. He sees the mighty oppressing the weak. He sees the shepherds abusing the daughters of Yisro, and he gives up. And God wants to say, I am here to be found if you're looking for me. In a world of destruction, there are two approaches to life. The house is burning. It's over. Or we have to work harder to find God in this space. It's no coincidence that Moshe begins his life in isolation. Remember, Moshe is born and hidden away for 3 months. And then when he can no longer hide, Moshe's mother, Yocheved, puts him in a teva. When Noach is looking at a world to be destroyed, he blocks everything out and he gets inside the teva to protect himself. Moshe Ussa was placed in a teva and was set on a lonely journey by himself. What saves Moshe? Such an ironic move. Within the home of a genocidal, maniacal king exists a daughter who hears the cry of a baby and says, I have to save the vulnerable. Moshe is alive because Bitya, the daughter of Paro, went to protect him. What's stunning about Moshe is we don't call him by his Hebrew name. The Torah tells us we call him Moshe by the name his mother gave him, by the name Batya gave him. We call Moshe by his Egyptian name because that's the lesson Moshe is learning, that there is good within the context of bad. You have to seek it out. Moshe, for the rest of his life, will find moments of profound isolation out of the necessity of the position that he finds himself in. He'll be at the top of Har Chorev again with the Jewish people. He'll be at the top of Mount Sinai again by himself for 40 days. He was 40 years in the desert by himself. He led the Jewish people for 40 years through the desert. Moshe experienced isolation, and the question in isolation is, do you see the good? Do you find the opportunity to recognize and to celebrate kindness? Or are you defined? Do you let yourself be defined by the destruction? Moshe has to spend 40 years in isolation to understand how powerful, how important it is to never give up hope on the Jewish people, to never give up hope on each other. It's a lesson that is taught to him from a very young age. And it's a lesson that God states explicitly. I never give up, God says. I am always with the Jewish people, no matter where they go. And Moshe, your job is to always be with the Jewish people, to never give up. When the Jewish people worship the golden calf, Moshe, God says to Moshe, I'm going to destroy these people. And Moshe says, I can't imagine a world, I can't imagine a reality where you destroy the Jewish people and I have to go on. Moshe transforms incredibly into the greatest advocate of the Jewish people, understanding that they always have God with them, and therefore there is always a reason to be hopeful. I want to conclude by sharing a video that was making its rounds a month ago or so, a profound video that I believe this is probably one of the last videos that Rabbi Sachs recorded, that I think speaks to the question that Moshe himself asked of God. When Moshe found himself pleading for the safety, the security of the Jewish people following the Egel Hazav, when God wants to destroy them and Moshe successfully intervenes, Moshe sees an opportunity and says to God, I have one question, show me your ways. Show me. The commentaries say, what does Moshe want? Moshe's reached the 49th level of purity, the 49th level of holiness, and the one last thing he doesn't understand is, why do bad things happen to good people? And he asks Moshe, he asks Hashem, why do bad things happen to good people? And Hashem says, no one can understand, but I am with them no matter what. So I share with you, by way of conclusion, this final clip of Rav Sachs answering that question, famous question that was posed to him shortly before his passing.
It's a beautiful quote. You just did. I started off telling you about my parents, and it just comes to mind. I remember my father said to us that the last time he saw you, you remembered my mother had asked you a question, why do bad things happen to good people? And you said to my father, tell your wife I still don't have an answer for her. I was wondering if you had any more insight.
Yes, I do, actually.
Oh.
God does not want us to understand why bad things happen to good people. Because if we ever understood, we would be forced to accept that bad things happen to good people. And God does not want us to accept those bad things. He wants us not to understand so that we will fight against the bad and the injustices of this world. And that is why there is no answer to that question, because God has arranged that we shall never have an answer to it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for indulging me in using this new technology. Mirza Hashem, please God, we should always find God in our lives in this isolation that we are living through. We should be able to find Yehi Ratzon, maybe God's will, that we can always feel his presence. Understand what Moshe understood, that God is with us wherever we are, wherever we go. God is with us in whatever difficult moment we find ourselves. And Amir Hashem, we should partner with God, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to bring more light into this world, to bring more goodness into this world, and to be relentlessly committed to justice, relentlessly committed to kindness, relentlessly committed to generosity, and to caring for the weak, to caring for those who need help. Wishing everyone a wonderful evening. I can't wait to learn more with you. Sefer Shemos, wonderful stories, special stories. Again, if you have any more thoughts about Moshe Rabbeinu, about the values that defined his life, please feel free to email me, to be in touch with me. Thank you so much for joining. Mirza Hashem, we'll have more opportunities to learn together soon. And we'll hear an end to this crazy pandemic, Bakarov, very soon. Have a good evening. Take care. Shalom.